The blood on her hands wasn't hers, but the shame burning in her chest felt just as real as Josephine Delaney knelt by the river's edge, scrubbing her father's work shirts until her knuckles turned raw. The year was 1873, and the Arkansas sun beat down mercilessly on the rolling hills outside Muskogee, where the Arkansas River ran steady and cold even in August. She had been washing clothes here every Tuesday and Friday for the past 3 years, ever since her mother passed, and the solitude had become something she craved more than company. At 22, most women her age were married with children, but Josephine had turned down every suitor who came calling at her father's modest farmhouse, much to his frustration. The water ran clear between her fingers as she wrung out another shirt, laying it across the smooth river rocks to dry in the sun. Her dark hair was tied back with a faded blue ribbon, and her simple cotton dress was already damp from the spray. She worked with practiced efficiency, her movements rhythmic and sure, finding peace in the repetitive motion. The river sang its ancient song around her, and for a few precious hours, she could forget about the loneliness that haunted their empty house, forget about the creditors who came knocking with increasing frequency, forget about her father's declining health and his growing dependence on whiskey to ease whatever pain lived inside him. She didn't hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her, the sound of hooves muffled by the soft earth near the riverbank. Josephine looked up sharply, her heart jumping into her throat as a rider emerged from the cottonwood trees that lined the water. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a dusty brown hat that shadowed his face, and he led his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the open country. For a moment, she considered gathering her things and fleeing, but something in his posture told her he meant no harm. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat as he drew closer. His voice was deep and careful, the kind of voice that measured its words before speaking them. "I don't mean to intrude on your privacy. I saw the washing and wondered if you might be willing to take on some extra work for fair payment." Josephine stood slowly, wiping her wet hands on her apron. Now that he was closer, she could see his face beneath the brim of his hat. He was young, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of summer sky. A scar ran along his jawline, white against his tanned skin, and his dark hair curled slightly where it touched his collar. He had the lean, hard look of a man who worked cattle for a living, all muscle and sinew with no excess flesh. "I do my own family's washing, sir," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I don't take in laundry for payment." He dismounted in one fluid motion, and she noticed he moved with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. In his hands, he held a bundled shirt and what looked like spare clothing. "I understand, madam. But I've been on the trail for near about 3 weeks, and everything I own is so caked with dirt it could probably walk to the river by itself. I'd be happy to pay you $2 if you'd be willing to help me out. I can wait right here, keep my distance. I promise I'm no trouble." $2 was more than her father made in a week doing odd jobs around town. Josephine found herself considering the offer despite her better judgment. There was something honest in the cowboy's face, something that made her believe he truly was just a weary traveler in need of help. She glanced at his horse, a sturdy bay mare with kind eyes, and saw the bedroll and saddlebags that spoke of a man living rough on the land. "What's your name?" she asked. "Vincent Irving, madam. I work for the Double J Ranch about 40 miles north of here. Been driving cattle to Fort Smith and I'm on my way back home." "You're alone." The rest of the crew took the main road. "I had some personal business to attend to in Muskogee." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable standing with his bad leg. I know it's unusual, me approaching you like this. If you'd rather I move along, I understand completely." Josephine looked at the bundle in his hands, then back at his face. She had always prided herself on being a good judge of character, and something about Vincent Irving seemed decent despite the unconventional circumstances. Besides, $2 would buy medicine for her father and food for their table. "Set your things down over there," she said, pointing to a flat rock away from where she'd been working. "Stay on that side of the washing area where I can see you." Relief washed over his features. "Yes, madam. Thank you, madam." He did exactly as she instructed, setting his bundle down and then moving to sit on a fallen log about 20 feet away. He removed his hat and set it on his knee, and Josephine found herself stealing glances at him as she retrieved his clothes and brought them to the water. True to his word, everything was filthy beyond measure, and she set to work with renewed vigor, scrubbing at stains that looked like they'd been there since creation. "You from Muskogee?" Vincent asked after several minutes of silence. "My whole life," Josephine replied, not looking up from her work. "My father owns a small farm about 2 miles east of town, mostly wheat, some vegetables. Must be hard work farming this land." "Everything worth doing is hard work, Mr. Irving." She heard what might have been a soft chuckle. "That's the truth. You got brothers to help with the heavy labor, just me and my father. My mother passed 3 years ago, and I never had siblings." The words came out more bitter than she intended, and she immediately regretted sharing so much with a stranger. "I'm sorry for your loss," Vincent said quietly. "I lost my own mother when I was 15. It's a wound that doesn't heal quite right, even with time." Josephine paused in her scrubbing, surprised by the genuine sympathy in his voice. Most people offered empty condolences and quickly changed the subject. "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "But you learn to live with it, I suppose." They fell into a more comfortable silence after that, with only the sound of water and the occasional bird call breaking the quiet. Josephine worked through his clothes methodically, her curiosity growing with each item. His shirts were well made but worn, patched in places with careful stitches that suggested he'd done the mending himself. His bandanas were faded from countless washings, and his spare trousers had been hemmed recently with uneven stitches that made her smile despite herself. "You do your own sewing, Mr. Irving." "I try, madam. Can't say I'm any good at it, but a man living on his own has to learn to make do." "You're not married then?" The question was out before she could stop herself, and heat rushed to her cheeks. It was entirely inappropriate to ask such a thing, but Vincent didn't seem offended. "No, madam. Never found a woman willing to put up with a broken-down cowboy with more scars than sense." His tone was light, but Josephine detected something deeper beneath the words, a loneliness that mirrored her own. She wrung out his last shirt and laid it on the rocks beside his other clean clothes. "You're not broken down, Mr. Irving. You move just fine for a man who's been 3 weeks on the trail." "You're kind to say so." Josephine gathered his wet clothes and carried them to the sunny rocks, arranging them carefully so they'd dry evenly. The afternoon sun was strong, and she estimated everything would be dry within 2 hours. She returned to her own washing, acutely aware of Vincent's presence even though he remained still and quiet on his log. "What brought you to Muskogee?" she asked, surprising herself again with her boldness. Perhaps it was the isolation of the riverbank, or the strange intimacy of washing a man's clothes, but she found herself wanting to know more about this quiet cowboy. Vincent was silent for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her look up. "I came to buy a ring." "A ring?" "Yes, madam. There's a jeweler in town, Mr. Abernathy, who does fine work. I've been saving for near about 2 years to afford one of his pieces." Josephine's heart did an unexpected flutter, and she told herself firmly that it was none of her business who Vincent Irving intended to marry. "That's very romantic," she managed to say. "I don't know about romantic," Vincent said with a self-deprecating laugh. "Truth is, I'm not even sure I'll have the courage to give it to her when the time comes. Any woman would be lucky to receive such a thoughtful gift." "That's generous of you to say, but you haven't met the woman in question." Josephine scrubbed at her father's work shirt with unnecessary force, telling herself the sudden tightness in her chest was simply from breathing in too much river spray. She had known this man for less than an hour. There was absolutely no reason she should feel disappointed that he was planning to propose to someone else. They continued working in silence, and Josephine finished her own washing just as Vincent's clothes began to dry. She spread her father's shirts and her own simple dresses on the rocks, then sat down on the riverbank with her feet tucked under her skirt, watching the water flow past. She could feel Vincent's eyes on her occasionally, but whenever she glanced his way, he was staring out at the horizon or examining his hat with great concentration. "Tell me about ranch life," she said eventually, unable to bear the silence any longer. "I've lived in Muskogee my whole life, but I've never been to a real cattle ranch." Vincent seemed to relax at the question, and he began describing life at the Double J Ranch with an eloquence that surprised her. He talked about the endless sky and the way the grass turned gold in autumn, about riding fence lines in all weather and the satisfaction of honest work. He spoke of the other cowboys he worked with, rough men with good hearts, and the ranch owner, Mr. Jefferson Johnston, who treated his employees fairly and paid on time. "It sounds wonderful," Josephine said wistfully. "Lonely, perhaps, but wonderful." "It can be lonely," Vincent admitted. "Especially in winter when the work slows down and there's too much time for thinking. But there's a freedom to it too, a sense that you're part of something bigger than yourself. The land doesn't care about your past or your mistakes. It just asks that you respect it and work hard." "I think I'd like that," Josephine said softly. "The not caring about the past part, I mean." Vincent looked at her with such understanding in his blue eyes that she had to glance away. "We all have things we'd rather leave behind, Miss Delaney." She realized then that she'd never told him her last name. "How did you know?" I asked in town before I rode out here. "The shopkeeper mentioned that a Miss Josephine Delaney did her washing at the river every Tuesday and Friday. Said you were honest and hardworking and didn't suffer fools." He smiled, and it transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "I figured if I was going to approach a woman alone by the river, I ought to at least know her name first." Josephine found herself smiling back. "And what else did the shopkeeper tell you?" "That your father's been having hard times since your mother passed. That you've turned down every marriage proposal you've received, including one from the banker's son. That you're known for your sharp tongue and your kind heart, though folks see more of the former than the latter. Mr. Henderson talks too much." "Maybe so, but he speaks highly of you. Said you were the best woman in Muskogee, even if you were too stubborn for your own good." Josephine laughed despite herself, the sound surprising them both. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed with genuine amusement. "Well, Mr. Henderson should mind his own business." "Probably," Vincent agreed, "but I'm glad he didn't." They looked at each other across the distance of the riverbank, and something passed between them, some unspoken recognition that made Josephine's breath catch. She could see the loneliness in Vincent's eyes, the same aching solitude that she carried in her own heart, and for a moment, the space between them felt both impossibly vast and dangerously small. The spell was broken by the sound of approaching voices. Josephine turned to see two women from town coming through the trees, carrying their own laundry baskets. She recognized them immediately as the Taylor sisters, notorious gossips who would have the whole town talking by sunset if they saw her here alone with a strange man. Vincent must have understood the situation immediately because he stood and moved to his drying clothes, checking them with exaggerated care. The Taylor sisters emerged from the trees and stopped short when they saw the scene. Josephine Delaney, the elder sister, Martha, said with barely concealed delight, "We didn't expect to find you entertaining company at your washing spot." "Mr. Irving is a customer," Josephine said coolly, standing and brushing off her skirt. "He paid me to wash his travel clothes." Surely there's no harm in honest work. The younger sister, Ruth, eyed Vincent with undisguised interest. "A customer? How enterprising of you, Josephine. Perhaps you should set up a proper laundry business instead of hiding out here by the river." Vincent stepped forward, his expression polite but firm. "Ladies, I assure you everything has been entirely proper. Miss Delaney was kind enough to help a weary traveler, and I've kept a respectful distance throughout. I'd appreciate it if you'd speak well of her charity rather than spreading gossip that could harm her reputation." Martha sniffed. "We don't gossip, Mr. Irving. We simply share information." "Then share the information that Miss Delaney is a decent Christian woman who showed kindness to a stranger," Vincent said, his voice taking on an edge. "Anything else would be a lie, and I'm sure you wouldn't want to be known as liars." The sisters exchanged glances, clearly not accustomed to being challenged so directly. After a moment, Martha nodded stiffly. "Of course, Mr. Irving. We wouldn't dream of saying anything unkind about dear Josephine." They moved past to find their own washing spot upstream, their heads already bent together in whispered conversation. Josephine felt her stomach sink, knowing that despite Vincent's intervention, this encounter would be all over town by evening. Her father would hear about it, and she'd have to endure his questions and accusations. "I'm sorry," Vincent said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause you trouble." "It's not your fault," Josephine replied, gathering her half-dry laundry with quick, angry movements. "This town is so small that people have nothing better to do than invent scandals where none exist. Still, I should have thought about how it would look, me approaching you alone like this." Josephine paused in her gathering and looked at him. His face was lined with genuine regret, and she felt her anger soften. "Mr. Irving, you offered me honest work for honest pay. I chose to accept. Whatever consequences come from that are mine to bear, not yours." Vincent gathered his own clothes, most of which were still slightly damp but wearable. He pulled $2 silver from his pocket and held them out to her. "You did excellent work, Miss Delaney. Thank you." She took the coins, their weight solid and reassuring in her palm. "Thank you for your business, Mr. Irving." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, neither seeming to want to leave. Finally, Vincent cleared his throat. "Miss Delaney, I know this is forward of me, especially given what just happened, but would you allow me to call on you properly?" "At your home, with your father's permission." Josephine's heart leaped, then plummeted just as quickly. "What about the woman you're buying the ring for?" Vincent's expression grew strange, almost hopeful. "What if I told you that woman was standing right in front of me?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Josephine stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I don't understand. You said you'd been saving for 2 years. We only just met." "I know how it sounds," Vincent said, taking a careful step closer, "but hear me out. I've been coming to Muskogee every few months for the past 2 years, buying supplies for the ranch and making payments to Mr. Abernathy on that ring. And every time I came to town, I saw you. Sometimes you were at the general store, sometimes walking to church, once loading feed sacks onto your wagon with strength that impressed me. I asked about you, learned your name, heard about your character. I admired you from afar, but I never had the courage to introduce myself properly. Josephine felt like she couldn't breathe. Why not? Because I'm just a cowboy with a bad leg and a scarred face. Because I have nothing to offer but hard work and an honest heart. Because a woman like you deserves better than a man who smells like cattle and lives in a bunkhouse. He twisted his hat in his hands, looking more vulnerable than she would have thought possible. But I saved anyway, hoping that someday I might find the courage to try. And then today, when I saw you here by the river, it felt like fate was giving me a chance I didn't deserve. You've been watching me for 2 years, Josephine asked, not sure whether to be flattered or concerned. Not watching in any improper way, Vincent said quickly. Just noticing, admiring, hoping. I know it sounds strange, but I fell in love with your strength, with the way you held your head high even when I could see the sadness in your eyes. I fell in love with your kindness when I saw you helping old Mrs. Peterson carry her groceries. I fell in love with your spirit when I heard you telling off a man who was being cruel to his horse. Tears were streaming down Josephine's face now, though she wasn't sure when she'd started crying. You don't even know me. I know enough to know I want to spend the rest of my life learning more, Vincent said. But if I'm wrong, if you feel nothing for me, I'll ride out of here and you'll never see me again. I promise. Josephine thought about the past hour, about the easy conversation and the comfortable silences, about the way her heart had lifted when he smiled and sunk when he mentioned buying a ring for someone else. She thought about the loneliness she'd been living with for 3 years, the emptiness of her days, the fear that she'd spend the rest of her life washing clothes by this river, alone and unloved. I don't know what I feel, she admitted. This is all happening so fast. I know, Vincent said gently. That's why I'm asking permission to court you properly, not asking you to marry me tomorrow. Let me come calling, let me meet your father, let us get to know each other in the light of day with everything proper and above board. And if after a time you decide you don't want me, I'll accept that and move on. And if I do want you, the words were barely a whisper. Vincent's face broke into the most beautiful smile she'd ever seen. Then I'll be the happiest man in Arkansas, and I'll spend every day trying to deserve you. Josephine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, aware that she must look a mess with her tear-stained face and damp dress. My father won't approve. He's been after me to marry the banker's son. I'll convince him, Vincent said with quiet confidence. I may not have a banker's money, but I'm a hard worker and I'll provide for you. I'll treat you with respect and honesty. I'll be faithful and true until my dying day. He drinks, Josephine warned, and he can be difficult when he's been drinking. My own father had the same affliction before he passed, Vincent said. I know how to handle difficult conversations. Josephine looked at this man who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, carrying his dirty laundry and a ring meant for her. It was the most ridiculous, improbable thing that had ever happened to her, and yet something in her heart was singing with a joy she'd thought long dead. You can come calling on Sunday afternoon, she said. 2 o'clock. The farm is 2 miles east on the main road, white house with green shutters. Vincent's smile could have lit up the whole territory. I'll be there. Thank you, Miss Delaney. You won't regret this, I promise. I'd better not, Mr. Irving, she said, but she was smiling too. He mounted his horse with some difficulty, his bad leg clearly paining him, but once he was in the saddle, he sat tall and confident. He tipped his hat to her one more time, his blue eyes warm with promise, and then rode off toward town, his damp clothes bundled behind his saddle. Josephine stood by the river for a long time after he left, holding her laundry basket and the $2 silver, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Part of her was convinced she'd lost her mind, agreeing to let a virtual stranger come courting. But another part, the part that had been slowly dying inside her for 3 years, felt suddenly, gloriously alive. She finished gathering her laundry and began the walk home, her mind already racing with thoughts of what she'd wear on Sunday, what she'd say to her father, how she'd explain any of this in a way that made sense. The Taylor sisters' gossip was the least of her worries now. She had 2 days to prepare for Vincent Irving's visit, 2 days to decide if she was brave enough to reach for happiness after so long in the shadows. The walk home seemed shorter than usual, her feet light despite the heavy laundry basket. When she reached the small farmhouse with its peeling paint and sagging porch, she found her father sitting in his chair outside, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow. Thomas Delaney was only 52, but he looked 20 years older, his face weathered by grief and alcohol, his hands shaking as he raised the bottle to his lips. "You're back late," he said, his words only slightly slurred. "Have trouble with the washing." "I took on a customer," Josephine said, setting down her basket. "A cowboy needed his clothes washed. He paid me $2. Her father's eyes sharpened with interest. $2 for washing clothes? "Yes, Papa." She pulled the coins from her pocket and held them out. "I thought we could use it for supplies." Thomas reached for the money, but Josephine closed her fist around it. "There's something else. The cowboy, his name is Vincent Irving, and he's asked permission to come calling on Sunday." Her father's expression darkened. "Calling on you? What kind of nonsense is this? You don't even know the man." "That's why he wants to come calling, Papa, so we can get to know each other properly." "Properly? You met him alone by the river. That's about as improper as it gets." Thomas stood unsteadily, grabbing the porch rail for support. "What were you thinking, girl? Do you want to ruin what's left of your reputation?" "Nothing improper happened," Josephine said firmly. "He hired me to wash his clothes and stayed a respectful distance the entire time, and he's coming to visit with your permission, as a gentleman should." "I don't give my permission," Thomas said flatly. "You'll marry Albert Mason like a sensible woman. He's been patient long enough." Albert Mason was the banker's son, a soft-handed man of 35 who still lived with his parents and had never done a day's hard work in his life. He'd proposed to Josephine 6 times over the past 2 years, and each time she'd refused, much to her father's fury. "I don't love Albert Mason," Josephine said. "I've told you this before." "Love?" Her father laughed bitterly. "Your mother and I didn't love each other when we married. Love comes later if you're lucky. Marriage is about security, about survival. Albert can give you that. What can this cowboy offer you? A life of poverty and hard labor. A life of honesty and respect," Josephine shot back. "Albert Mason looks at me like I'm a prize horse he wants to own. Vincent Irving looks at me like I'm a person." "Vincent Irving," her father repeated mockingly. "And how much does Mr. Irving make in a year? Does he own land? Does he have prospects beyond chasing cattle across the prairie?" "I don't know," Josephine admitted. "That's why I want to get to know him." Thomas sank back into his chair, suddenly looking very old and tired. "You're all I have left, Josie. Your mother's gone, the farm is failing, and I'm not long for this world. I just want to see you settled before I go." Josephine felt her anger softening into pity. She knelt beside her father's chair and took his trembling hand. "Papa, you're not dying, and I will get settled, I promise. But I need to do it my way with a man I can respect." "This cowboy won't wait for you," Thomas said. "Men like that, they blow through town like tumbleweeds. He'll make pretty promises and then disappear, and you'll be left with nothing but regrets." "Maybe," Josephine said, "but I have to find out for myself." Her father was silent for a long moment, staring out at the fields that had once grown tall with wheat and now stood mostly empty. Finally, he sighed. He can come on Sunday, but I'll be the judge of his character, and if I don't like what I see, you'll send him away and never speak to him again. Agreed, agreed, Josephine said, though she had no intention of honoring that promise if her father's judgment was clouded by whiskey and prejudice. She spent the rest of the evening preparing dinner and tidying the house, her mind constantly drifting to Vincent Irving and his blue eyes and his impossible story about saving for 2 years to buy her a ring. It still seemed like something from a dream, too perfect and strange to be real. Yet the $2 in her pocket were real enough, and the memory of his smile was already burned into her heart. That night, she lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought about the life she'd been living for the past 3 years, the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and washing, the loneliness that had become so familiar she'd almost stopped noticing it. She thought about her mother, who had died slowly and painfully, her strength wasted away by some sickness the doctor couldn't name. She thought about her father, pickling himself in whiskey and grief, watching their farm die around him. And she thought about Vincent Irving, sitting on that fallen log by the river, speaking with such honesty about loneliness and mistakes, and the freedom of working under an endless sky. She thought about the way he'd defended her to the Taylor sisters, the way he'd asked permission to court her properly, even though he was clearly nervous about her answer. She thought about the ring he'd been saving for, made just for her by a jeweler in town, waiting for the right moment to be given. Saturday passed in a blur of nervous energy. Josephine cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors that were already clean and dusting shelves that held nothing but her mother's few precious belongings. She baked bread and made a simple cake, using up their last bit of sugar. She mended her best dress, the blue one her mother had made for her 4 years ago, and pressed it carefully. She washed her hair and brushed it until it shone, then practiced arranging it in different styles before finally deciding to keep it simple, pulled back with her mother's silver combs. Her father watched her preparations with a mixture of amusement and disapproval, but he stayed mostly sober on Saturday, perhaps understanding that he needed to be clear-headed for Sunday's meeting. He even shaved and put on his better shirt, though he grumbled about putting on airs for a cowboy. Sunday morning, Josephine was too nervous to eat breakfast. She attended church with her father as usual and had to endure the curious stares of the entire congregation. The Taylor sisters had clearly been busy spreading their version of events, and Josephine heard whispers following her through the church grounds. She held her head high and ignored them all, though inside she was trembling. By 1:30, she was dressed and ready, pacing the small parlor like a caged animal. Her father sat in his chair, pretending to read a newspaper that was 3 weeks old. The cake sat on their best plate, and she'd brewed coffee that was now going cold in the pot. At precisely 2 o'clock, they heard the sound of a horse approaching. Josephine rushed to the window and saw Vincent riding up the path, his hat in his hand, his hair still wet from what must have been a very recent washing. He was wearing clean clothes, a dark shirt and trousers that looked new, and he'd shaved the stubble from his jaw. Even with his scar and his limp, he was the most handsome man she'd ever seen. He tied his horse to the post and walked to the door, his movements careful and deliberate. Josephine took a deep breath and opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Irving," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Welcome, please come in." "Miss Delaney," he said, his blue eyes lighting up at the sight of her. "You look beautiful." Heat rushed to her cheeks. "Thank you." "This is my father, Thomas Delaney. Papa, this is Vincent Irving." Vincent stepped inside and immediately extended his hand to Thomas. Mr. Delaney, sir, thank you for allowing me to visit. I know this is unusual circumstances, and I appreciate your understanding. Thomas stood slowly and shook Vincent's hand, studying him with narrowed eyes. Sit down, Mr. Irving. My daughter tells me you're a cowboy at the Double J Ranch. Yes, sir. I've worked there for 5 years, ever since I left my family's farm in Missouri after my parents passed. They all sat, Josephine perching nervously on the edge of her chair, her father leaning back with his arms crossed, Vincent sitting upright with his hat balanced on his knee. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Josephine jumped up. "Coffee," she asked brightly. "And I made cake." "That would be lovely, thank you," Vincent said. She fled to the kitchen, grateful for the excuse to escape the tension in the room. As she arranged coffee cups and cake slices on a tray, she strained to hear the conversation in the parlor. "So you make what, $30 a month?" Her father was asking. "40, sir. I'm one of the senior hands now, and Mr. Johnston values experience." $40 a month to chase cattle across the territory, and you think that's enough to support a wife? I have savings, sir. I've been putting away money for the past 5 years. I have nearly $400 saved, plus the value of my horse and equipment. And Mr. Johnston has offered me a partnership if I can raise enough capital. He's getting older and wants to transition some of the ranch operations to his senior staff. Josephine nearly dropped the tray. $400 was more money than she'd ever imagined, and the possibility of a partnership meant Vincent had real prospects, not just empty promises. Partnership in a ranch, her father was saying thoughtfully when she returned with the tray. That's ambitious. Yes, sir. I believe in setting goals and working toward them with discipline and patience. Thomas took a cup of coffee and a slice of cake, still studying Vincent with that calculating expression. My daughter says you've been coming to Muskogee for 2 years. Yes, sir. For ranch supplies primarily, but also to make payments on a ring I was having made at Abernathy's jewelry shop. A ring, Thomas repeated. And this ring is for Josephine, if she'll have it, sir, though I'm getting ahead of myself. I came here today to ask your permission to court your daughter properly, with the intention of marriage if we suit each other. Josephine held her breath. This was the moment that would determine everything. Her father could say no, could order Vincent to leave and never come back. She wouldn't be able to stop him, not without causing a scandal that would make the Taylor sisters' gossip look mild. Thomas was silent for a long time, sipping his coffee and eating his cake with deliberate slowness. Finally, he set down his plate and looked directly at Vincent. I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Irving. I'd rather my daughter marry Albert Mason. He's established, he's local, and he can provide her with comfort and security without her having to leave everything she knows. But Josephine is a grown woman with her own mind, and she's made it clear she won't have Albert. So my question to you is this: what makes you think you're good enough for my daughter? It was a brutal question, designed to put Vincent on the defensive, but Vincent didn't flinch. Nothing, sir. I don't think I'm good enough for her. I think she's the finest woman I've ever met, and I'd spend every day trying to become worthy of her. But I can promise you this: I'll work hard to provide for her. I'll treat her with respect and kindness. I'll be faithful to her until my dying breath, and I'll do everything in my power to make her happy. I can't promise wealth or luxury, but I can promise honesty and love. Josephine felt tears pricking her eyes again. The raw sincerity in Vincent's voice was undeniable, and even her father seemed moved by it. Love doesn't pay the bills, Thomas said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. No, sir, but hard work does, and I'm not afraid of hard work. I've been supporting myself since I was 15 years old, and I've never missed a day's work in my life except when I broke my leg 3 years ago, and even then I was back in the saddle within 6 weeks against the doctor's orders. That how you got the limp? Yes, sir. Horse stepped in a gopher hole and went down hard. I was lucky it was just my leg and not my neck. Thomas was quiet again, and Josephine could see him wavering. Finally, he looked at her. What do you think, Josie? You've barely said 2 words since Mr. Irving arrived. Josephine met Vincent's eyes across the room and saw the hope and fear there, the same emotions she was feeling. I think Mr. Irving is honest and honorable, and I'd like the chance to know him better, even if it means leaving Muskogee. Because if you marry this man, you'll be living 40 miles away at some ranch in the middle of nowhere. Even then, Josephine said firmly. Thomas sighed heavily. Against my better judgment, I'm going to give my permission for you to court my daughter, Mr. Irving. But understand this. If you hurt her, if you mistreat her, if you prove to be anything less than the man you're presenting yourself as today, I will come after you with everything I have. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, sir, Vincent said, and I welcome your scrutiny. I have nothing to hide. We'll see about that, Thomas said, but he was almost smiling. Now, tell me more about this partnership opportunity at the Double J. The conversation shifted to business matters, and Josephine felt herself relaxing for the first time since Vincent arrived. Her father was actually engaging with him, asking intelligent questions about cattle prices and land management, and the economics of running a ranch. Vincent answered everything thoroughly and honestly, and she could see her father's respect growing despite his initial prejudice. They talked for 2 hours, and by the time Vincent stood to leave, Thomas was shaking his hand with genuine warmth. You can come calling next Sunday, Mr. Irving, and any other time that's convenient as long as it's not interfering with Josephine's work. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your trust. Josephine walked Vincent out to his horse, her heart soaring. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold and the world felt full of possibility. That went well, Vincent said quietly. Better than I hoped, honestly. My father likes you, Josephine said, still slightly amazed. I can tell. He loves you and he wants what's best for you. I respect that. Vincent pulled something from his saddlebag, a small wrapped package. I know it's premature, but I wanted you to have this. It's not the ring, just something I saw in town yesterday and thought of you. Josephine unwrapped the package to find a beautiful blue ribbon, the exact color of her best dress. It's lovely, she whispered. I noticed your hair ribbon was faded, Vincent said, looking slightly embarrassed. I thought you might like a new one. I love it, thank you. She clutched the ribbon to her chest, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. They stood there looking at each other, and Vincent reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't move, he gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I meant what I said in there, he told her. I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you. You already are, Josephine said. Vincent smiled, that transformative smile that made her heart skip, and then he mounted his horse. I'll see you next Sunday, Miss Delaney. I'll be here, Mr. Irving. She watched him ride away until he disappeared down the road, then stood there for several more minutes, holding her new ribbon and trying to convince herself this was all real. When she finally went back inside, she found her father sitting in his chair with a thoughtful expression. He's a good man, Thomas said without preamble, better than I expected. Yes, Josephine agreed, but he's still a cowboy with no guarantees. Life at a ranch is hard, Josie, harder than you can imagine. I know, Papa. And if you marry him, you'll be far from home, far from everything familiar. I know that too. Thomas looked at her with sad, understanding eyes. But you're going to do it anyway, aren't you? You're already half in love with him. Josephine thought about denying it, but what was the point? I think I might be, yes. Then I won't stand in your way, her father said. But take your time, get to know him properly. Make sure this isn't just loneliness making you both see what you want to see instead of what's really there. It was good advice, and Josephine took it to heart over the following weeks. Vincent came calling every Sunday, and sometimes on Wednesday evenings when he could get away from the ranch. They took long walks around the farm, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his parents to cholera, about the hard years of working his way from ranch to ranch until he found his place at the Double J. She told him about her mother's illness, about watching her father retreat into grief and whiskey, about her fears and dreams and the loneliness that had become her constant companion. They discovered they had much in common despite their different backgrounds. Both loved reading, though books were scarce in both their lives. Both valued honesty above all else, having been hurt too many times by pretty lies. Both wanted children someday, a family built on love and respect rather than convenience and obligation. But they also learned about their differences. Vincent was quiet and thoughtful, slow to anger but impossible to sway once he'd made up his mind. Josephine was quicker to react, more willing to speak her mind even when silence might be wiser. He was patient to a fault, while she struggled with impatience when things moved too slowly. He loved the open sky and endless spaces, while she found comfort in the familiar rhythms of town life. Yet somehow, their differences complemented rather than conflicted. Where Vincent was too cautious, Josephine pushed him to be bold. Where she was too rash, he helped her think things through. They balanced each other, and Josephine began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this impossible love story might actually work. 6 weeks after their first meeting, Vincent asked her to come to town with him. They rode together on his horse, Josephine sitting side saddle in front of him, acutely aware of his arm around her waist keeping her steady. He led them to Abernathy's jewelry shop, a small establishment tucked between the general store and the barber. Mr. Abernathy was a tiny man with wire spectacles and hands that moved with surprising delicacy. He smiled when he saw Vincent and immediately disappeared into the back room, returning with a small velvet box. "It's finished," he said simply. Vincent took the box with reverent care and turned to Josephine. "I wanted you to see it before I formally proposed. If you don't like it, I can have him make changes." Josephine's hands were trembling as Vincent opened the box. Inside was the most beautiful ring she'd ever seen, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light and sparkled like captured stars. It wasn't ostentatious or showy, just perfect and pure and exactly right. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "The diamond is small," Vincent said apologetically. "But it's a real one, not glass, and the gold is pure. I wanted it to last a lifetime." "It's perfect," Josephine said, tears streaming down her face. "It's absolutely perfect." Vincent dropped to one knee right there in the jewelry shop, still holding the open box. "Josephine Delaney, I know we've only been courting for 6 weeks, but I've loved you for 2 years and I'll love you for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Josephine said without hesitation. "Yes, yes, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, which of course it had. Then he stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close while Mr. Abernathy discreetly wiped his own eyes and pretended to be very busy with his ledger. "I'll take good care of her," Vincent whispered into her hair. "I promise." "I know you will," Josephine said. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Muskogee, with half the town in attendance despite the short notice. Josephine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slimmer frame, and carried wildflowers that Vincent had ridden out at dawn to pick. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and when he placed her hand in Vincent's, he whispered, "Be happy, Josie girl." Vincent's boss, Mr. Johnston, came to the wedding with several of the ranch hands, rough men who cleaned up surprisingly well in their Sunday clothes. They brought gifts of practical items, cast iron skillets and wool blankets, and a beautiful set of dishes wrapped carefully in newspaper. Albert Mason attended as well, looking sour but bringing an expensive silver tea service that Josephine suspected his mother had chosen. The wedding reception was held at the church, with food provided by the townswomen and music from old Mr. Henderson on his fiddle. Josephine danced with her father, with Mr. Johnston, with several of the ranch hands who stepped on her toes and apologized profusely. But most of all, she danced with Vincent, who held her like she was made of spun glass and looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever prayed. As the sun began to set, they said their goodbyes and rode out toward the Double J Ranch, Josephine sitting in front of Vincent on his horse, her wedding dress tucked up to keep it clean. She carried a small bag with her few possessions, everything else having been sold or given away. She was leaving behind her whole life, her father, her town, everything familiar, to ride off into the sunset with a man she'd known for less than 3 months. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt nothing but joy. The Double J Ranch was everything Vincent had described and more. The ranch house was a sprawling structure of wood and stone, and the bunkhouse where Vincent had been living was a long, low building that smelled of tobacco and leather. But Mr. Johnston had surprised them both by offering them a small cabin on the edge of the property. A wedding gift, he said, though Josephine suspected Vincent had been working toward earning it for years. The cabin was simple, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was clean and sturdy with a good fireplace and windows that looked out over rolling prairie. Vincent carried her over the threshold, his bad leg nearly giving out under their combined weight, and they both laughed as he steadied himself. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irving," he said. "It's perfect," Josephine said, looking around at their new home. "Absolutely perfect." That night, they lay together in the narrow bed that Mr. Johnston had provided, Vincent holding Josephine close while she trembled with nervous anticipation. He was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like 2 pieces of a puzzle finally finding their fit. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the prairie night. Coyotes howled in the distance, and somewhere an owl called out its hunting cry. "Are you happy?" Vincent asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Josephine said honestly. "Are you?" "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find this was all a dream," Vincent admitted. "That I'm still sleeping in the bunkhouse and you're still washing clothes by the river and we never met." "It's not a dream," Josephine said, pressing a kiss to his scarred jaw. "I'm here, you're here, and we have the rest of our lives ahead of us." "The rest of our lives," Vincent repeated, wonder in his voice. "I like the sound of that." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Josephine dreamed of a future filled with love and laughter, with children running through the prairie grass and growing old together under that endless sky. The reality of ranch life hit Josephine hard in the first few weeks. She'd known it would be difficult, but knowing and experiencing were 2 different things. She woke before dawn to cook breakfast for Vincent before he headed out to work, then spent her days learning to manage their household with limited supplies and resources. Water had to be hauled from the well, laundry had to be done by hand in a large tub, and cooking on the fireplace required skills she'd never needed in her father's house with its proper stove. But Vincent was patient with her mistakes, praising her efforts even when dinner was burned or his shirts came out of the wash still dirty. He helped whenever he could, hauling water before he left in the morning, chopping extra wood for the fire, bringing her wildflowers he found on the range just to make her smile. And slowly, Josephine found her rhythm. She learned to bake bread in the fireplace, to make stews that could simmer all day while she worked on other tasks, to scrub clothes until they came clean without wearing holes in the fabric. She befriended some of the other ranch wives, women who lived in similar cabins scattered across the property, and they taught her the skills she needed to survive. She learned to ride a horse, something she'd never done in town, so she could visit the other wives without having to walk miles across the prairie. She learned to shoot a rifle to protect herself from snakes and other threats when Vincent was out on the range. She learned to preserve food for winter, to make soap and candles, to patch clothes so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the repairs. It was hard work, harder than anything she'd done before, but there was a satisfaction to it that washing clothes for her father had never provided. This was her home, her life, built by her own hands alongside the man she loved. Every skill she mastered, every challenge she overcame, made her stronger and more confident. And in the evenings, when Vincent came home dusty and exhausted from a long day of working cattle, they would sit together on the porch of their cabin and watch the sun set over the prairie. He'd tell her about his day, about the ornery cow that had gotten stuck in a ravine, or the new calf that had been born, or the fence line that needed mending. She'd tell him about her victories and failures, about the bread that had turned out perfectly, or the vegetables she'd planted in their small garden. They'd go to bed early, both too tired for anything but holding each other close, and Josephine would fall asleep feeling grateful for every moment of hardship that had led her to this life. 3 months after their wedding, Josephine realized she was pregnant. She'd been feeling unwell in the mornings, and certain smells that had never bothered her before now made her nauseous. She recognized the signs from watching other women in town, but she waited until she was certain before telling Vincent. She chose her moment carefully, preparing his favorite dinner of fried chicken and biscuits. When he came home that evening, she met him at the door with a smile that must have looked suspicious because he immediately asked what was wrong. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "Sit down, I have something to tell you." Vincent sat at their small table looking worried. "Are you all right? You're not sick, are you?" "I'm fine," Josephine assured him. "Better than fine, actually. Vincent, I'm going to have a baby." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she'd ever seen, and he jumped up from his chair so fast he nearly knocked it over. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and protested that he'd make her dizzy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're going to have a baby." "In about 6 months, I think," Josephine said when he finally set her down. "Are you happy?" "Happy." Vincent cupped her face in his hands, his blue eyes shining with tears. "Josephine, I'm the happiest man in the whole world." "No, in the whole universe. No, in all of creation." She laughed and kissed him. "I think we'll need to add on to the cabin. We can't raise a baby in 2 rooms." "I'll start tomorrow," Vincent promised. "We'll build the finest nursery in all of Arkansas." He kept his promise, working on the cabin addition every spare moment he had. The other ranch hands helped during their time off, and Mr. Johnston even gave Vincent a few days to focus solely on construction. They added 2 more rooms to the cabin, a nursery and a proper bedroom for Vincent and Josephine, and Vincent built a beautiful cradle out of oak wood that he sanded and polished until it was smooth as silk. Josephine's pregnancy was relatively easy, though she tired more quickly and had to be careful not to overdo her work. The other ranch wives rallied around her, bringing food and helping with the heavier chores. Even Vincent's boss stopped by occasionally with gifts for the baby, blankets his late wife had made and toys that had belonged to his own children decades ago. Her father came to visit once, making the long trip from Muskogee with obvious difficulty. He'd aged considerably in the months since her wedding, his hands shaking more than ever, his breathing labored. But he was sober when he arrived, and he spent 3 days at the ranch, marveling at the life Josephine had built. "You were right," he told her the night before he left. "Vincent is a good man, and this is a good life. I'm proud of you, Josie." "Thank you, Papa," she said, hugging him carefully. He felt so frail in her arms, all bones and loose skin. "I'm sorry I wasn't a better father after your mother died," Thomas said quietly. "I was lost without her, and I let my grief poison everything. But you turned out well despite me, and I'm grateful for that. You did your best, Papa. That's all anyone can do." He left the next morning, and Josephine watched him ride away with a heavy heart, knowing somehow that it might be the last time she saw him. The knowing made her sad but not devastated. She'd made her peace with her father and he with her, and that was enough. 6 weeks later, she received word that Thomas Delaney had passed away peacefully in his sleep. She and Vincent made the trip to Muskogee for the funeral, where Josephine said goodbye to her father and her old life once and for all. The farm was sold to pay off debts, and what little money remained Josephine put away for their baby's future. As they rode back to the ranch, Josephine felt the baby kick for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings against her ribs. She placed Vincent's hand on her stomach so he could feel it too, and they both sat there in wonder, feeling their child move inside her. "It's real," Vincent whispered. "There's really a baby in there. Did you doubt it?" Josephine asked with amusement. "I don't know. Maybe part of me thought it was too good to be true. But now I can feel it, and it's the most amazing thing I've ever experienced." Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1874, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being forced from his warm, comfortable home. The birth was long and difficult, with Josephine laboring for nearly 20 hours while Vincent paced outside the cabin and drove the midwife to distraction with his constant questions and worries. But when it was over, when the midwife placed their son in Josephine's arms, every moment of pain was forgotten. He was perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and blue eyes that would eventually turn brown. He had Vincent's nose and Josephine's mouth, and when Vincent held him for the first time, he wept openly with joy. They named him Thomas Vincent Irving after both their fathers and called him Tommy. He was a good baby, quick to smile and relatively easy to soothe, and both Vincent and Josephine fell completely in love with him. Vincent would come home from work and immediately scoop up his son, talking to him about cattle and horses and all the things they'd do together when Tommy was older. Josephine had never imagined she could love anyone as much as she loved Vincent, but Tommy opened up whole new chambers in her heart. Watching Vincent with their son, seeing the gentleness and patience he showed, made her fall in love with her husband all over again. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Josephine's days were consumed with feeding and changing and soothing, with stolen moments of sleep whenever Tommy napped. Vincent helped whenever he could, walking the floor with a crying baby in the middle of the night so Josephine could rest, changing diapers without complaint, singing off key lullabies that somehow always worked. The partnership opportunity that Mr. Johnston had mentioned finally came through when Tommy was 6 months old. Vincent would become part owner of a portion of the ranch, with the agreement that he'd eventually buy out Mr. Johnston's full interest when the older man was ready to retire. It meant more responsibility and harder work, but it also meant security for their family and a legacy to pass on to Tommy someday. They celebrated quietly that night, Tommy asleep in his cradle while Vincent and Josephine sat on their porch and looked out at land that was now partly theirs. "Can you believe it?" Vincent asked, his arm around Josephine's shoulders. "A year ago, I was just a cowboy with nothing but a dream and a ring I was too scared to give away. Now I have you and Tommy and a stake in this ranch. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to make sure it's all real." "It's real," Josephine assured him. "We made it real together." "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Vincent said seriously. "You're the strongest, bravest, most amazing woman I've ever known, and I thank God every day that you were washing clothes by the river that afternoon. I thank God you had the courage to approach me with your laundry and your impossible story about saving for 2 years to buy a ring for a woman you'd never spoken to." Vincent laughed. "It does sound pretty crazy when you put it like that." "It was crazy," Josephine agreed. "But it was also the most romantic thing anyone's ever done for me, and I wouldn't change a single moment of our story." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed and closer to home, their son made small sleeping sounds through the open window. This was their life now, built on hard work and honest love, and Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice that day by the river. The years passed swiftly after that. Tommy grew into a sturdy boy with his father's quiet nature and his mother's quick mind. When he was 3, Josephine gave birth to twin daughters, Sarah and Emma, who were as different as night and day despite sharing a face. Sarah was bold and adventurous, always climbing things she shouldn't and getting into mischief. Emma was gentle and thoughtful, content to sit quietly with a doll or help her mother in the garden. The cabin was expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and Vincent built onto it with the same care he'd shown when making Tommy's cradle. They now had 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a sitting room where the family gathered in the evenings. It was far from the grand houses in town, but it was warm and solid and filled with love. Mr. Johnston passed away peacefully when Tommy was 5. Leaving his full share of the ranch to Vincent as they'd agreed. Vincent was now the owner of the Double J Ranch, a responsibility he took seriously. He hired good men, treated them fairly, and built a reputation for running one of the best cattle operations in the territory. Money was never plentiful, but they always had enough. Josephine learned to make a little go a long way, sewing clothes from flour sacks and raising vegetables in their expanding garden. She taught the children to read using a few precious books they owned, and Vincent taught them to ride and rope, and all the skills they'd need to help run the ranch. When Tommy was 8, Josephine gave birth to their 4th child, another son they named Daniel. He was a happy baby who rarely cried, content to watch the world with curious eyes. With 4 children to manage, Josephine was busier than ever, but Vincent had hired a young woman from town to help with the housework, giving Josephine more time to focus on the children. Life wasn't always easy. There were harsh winters when they worried about the cattle dying, dry summers when the grass turned brown and the water holes dried up. There were illnesses that swept through the family, leaving them all weak and scared. There were financial worries when cattle prices dropped, or when they had to replace equipment that couldn't be repaired one more time. But through it all, Vincent and Josephine faced everything together. They made decisions as partners, supported each other through difficulties, and celebrated victories both large and small. Their love, which had begun so improbably by a river with dirty laundry and an impossible promise, had grown deeper and stronger with each passing year. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vincent surprised Josephine with a trip back to Muskogee. They left the children with the housekeeper and the older ranch hands who'd become like uncles to the children, and rode into town together just as they had on their wedding day. The town had grown in the past decade, with new businesses and houses spreading out from the original main street. But the river was unchanged, still flowing steady and cold, still lined with cottonwood trees. Vincent led Josephine to the exact spot where they'd first met, where she'd been washing clothes alone that long-ago August afternoon. "You remember?" he asked, dismounting and helping her down from her horse. "How could I forget?" Josephine said, looking around at the familiar rocks and trees. "I was so lonely that day, so certain I'd spend the rest of my life washing clothes and growing old alone. And then you appeared with your dirty laundry and your shy smile, and everything changed." Vincent pulled a small box from his saddlebag, similar to the one that had held her engagement ring 10 years before. "I wanted to give you this here, where it all started." Josephine opened the box to find a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant in the shape of a heart. Engraved on one side were the words "By the river," and on the other, "Forever yours, Vincent," she breathed, tears filling her eyes. "It's beautiful." He fastened it around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. "You gave me everything, Josephine, a home, a family, a purpose. You took a broken-down cowboy with nothing but a dream and made him the richest man in Arkansas." "You were never broken," Josephine said, turning to face him. "You were just waiting for the right person to see your worth." "And you were that person," Vincent said, pulling her close. "You always have been, from the very first moment I saw you." They stood there by the river, holding each other in the same spot where their story had begun, and Josephine marveled at the strange and wonderful path their lives had taken. Who would have thought that a chance encounter over laundry could lead to such happiness? Who could have predicted that a shy cowboy with a scar and a limp could turn out to be the love of her life? But life rarely followed predictable paths, and the best things often came when you least expected them. Josephine had learned that lesson well, and she'd spent the past 10 years being grateful for every unexpected blessing. They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The children rushed out to greet them, all talking at once about their day and what they'd done while their parents were gone. Vincent scooped up Daniel while Josephine hugged the twins, and Tommy stood slightly apart with the reserved dignity of a boy trying to be too grown up for such displays. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Vincent and Josephine sat on their porch as they'd done countless times before. The night was warm, and fireflies danced in the darkness like tiny fallen stars. "I was thinking," Vincent said slowly, "that maybe it's time we expanded the house again." Josephine looked at him in surprise. "Why, we have plenty of room now." "Well, I was hoping maybe we could use more room," Vincent said with a shy smile. "If you wanted to, I mean. I know 4 children is already a lot, but I love being a father, and I love our family, and I thought maybe." "Are you asking if I want to have another baby?" Josephine asked, her heart swelling with love for this man who was never quite able to come out and say what he meant. "Only if you want to," Vincent said quickly. "I know it's hard on you and you do so much already, but I thought if you were willing it might be nice to have one more." Josephine thought about it, about the sleepless nights and the exhaustion of pregnancy and childbirth, about the endless work of raising children. But she also thought about tiny hands reaching for her, about first smiles and first words, about the way Vincent's face lit up every time he held a baby. "I think one more would be perfect," she said. Vincent's smile could have lit up the whole territory. He kissed her deeply, full of promise and love, and Josephine kissed him back with equal passion. After 10 years of marriage, the fire between them had only grown stronger, tempered and refined by shared experiences and deep understanding. Their fifth child, a daughter they named Grace, was born the following spring when Josephine was 33. The birth was the easiest of all her deliveries, and Grace was a peaceful baby who seemed content just to exist. She had Vincent's blue eyes, eyes that stayed blue instead of changing like Tommy's had, and she had a sweet disposition that made everyone who met her fall in love. With 5 children, life at the ranch was chaotic but joyful. The older children helped with the younger ones, and Tommy in particular was a natural big brother, always patient with his siblings even when they got into his things or disrupted his activities. The twins were inseparable, creating their own language and getting into twice the trouble that a single child could manage. Daniel was the peacemaker, always trying to smooth over conflicts and make everyone happy. And Grace was simply Grace, bringing light and joy wherever she went. The ranch continued to prosper under Vincent's management. He developed a reputation for honesty and fair dealing, and buyers sought out his cattle specifically because they knew they'd be getting quality stock. He employed 15 hands now and had built a new bunkhouse to accommodate them all. The original cabin where he and Josephine had started their married life was now used for storage, but they kept it maintained as a reminder of their humble beginnings. When Tommy turned 12, Vincent began teaching him the business side of ranching, explaining how to keep books and negotiate prices and manage men. Tommy took to it naturally, showing the same quiet competence his father possessed. The twins were more interested in the horses than the cattle, and Vincent built them a small corral where they could train young horses under his supervision. Daniel, at 5 years old, showed an interest in reading and learning that reminded Josephine of herself. She taught him from the same books she'd learned from, watching with pride as he mastered letters and numbers with ease. And Grace, at 2, was content to toddle around after her mother, helping with simple tasks and chattering in her sweet baby voice about everything and nothing. Life was full and busy and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also rich with love and purpose. Josephine would sometimes think back to that lonely woman washing clothes by the river and barely recognize herself. She'd been so isolated then, so convinced that happiness was something that happened to other people. Now she knew better. Happiness wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built, day by day, with hard work and commitment and love. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Vincent gave her another gift, this time a beautiful handmade hope chest he'd been working on in secret for months. It was made of cedar and oak, with their initials carved into the lid along with those of all 5 children. Inside, she found carefully preserved mementos of their life together. The faded blue ribbon she'd been wearing the day they met, a pressed wildflower from their wedding bouquet, Tommy's first booty, a lock of hair from each child's first haircut, the newspaper clipping announcing Vincent's full ownership of the ranch. "I wanted you to have something to remember it all by," Vincent explained as she went through each item with tears streaming down her face. "All the moments that made us who we are." "As if I could ever forget," Josephine said, but she hugged the chest to her and knew she'd treasure it forever. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Tommy turned 18 and became Vincent's full partner in running the ranch, showing leadership skills that made his father proud. The twins, now 16, were accomplished horsewomen who helped train the ranch's stock and occasionally competed in local rodeos. Daniel, at 13, had developed a love of woodworking and spent his free time in the workshop Vincent had built for him, creating beautiful furniture and carvings. And Grace, at 10, was showing signs of her mother's practical nature, already running the household with surprising efficiency for one so young. Josephine was 43 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her hands' work roughened from years of labor. Vincent was 47, his limp more pronounced after long days in the saddle, his scar faded to a thin white line. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who'd met by the river all those years ago, still felt the same flutter of attraction and deep, abiding love. They'd built something lasting, something real. The ranch was thriving, their children were healthy and happy, and their love had only grown stronger with time. They'd weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, supported each other through loss and celebrated victories together. They'd created a legacy that would outlast them both, a family and a home built on the foundation of one improbable afternoon by a river. One evening, when all the children were occupied with their own activities, Vincent took Josephine's hand and led her outside. The sun was setting in a blaze of color, painting the prairie in shades of orange and purple and gold. They walked together to a small rise where they could see the entire ranch spread out before them, the house and barns and corrals, the cattle grazing in the distance, the land that had become their whole world. "You have any regrets?" Vincent asked, his arm around her waist. Josephine leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and horses and the outdoors. "Not a single one. You. Only that I didn't approach you sooner," Vincent said. "Think of all the time we could have had together if I'd been braver." "We had exactly the time we were meant to have," Josephine said wisely. "Everything happened exactly when it was supposed to happen." "I suppose you're right," Vincent agreed, "though I still say you're the best thing that ever happened to me." "And you're the best thing that ever happened to me," Josephine replied. "My cowboy with his laundry and his ring and his impossible promise to love me forever." "Not impossible," Vincent corrected gently. "I've been doing it for 18 years, and I plan to keep doing it for the rest of my life." "Forever then," Josephine said. "Forever," Vincent agreed. They stood there together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built a life worth living. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and eternal, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear their children's voices calling them back to the house. But for this moment, they stayed where they were, holding each other and watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. They'd started with nothing but hope and love and determination, a lonely woman by a river and a shy cowboy with a dream. And from those humble beginnings, they'd created something beautiful and lasting, a love story for the ages. Years later, when their grandchildren asked how their grandparents had met, Tommy would tell the story of the cowboy who approached a woman washing clothes by the river, bringing his dirty laundry and a ring he'd been saving for 2 years to buy for a woman he'd never spoken to. The grandchildren would laugh at the impossibility of it all, and Tommy would smile and tell them that's how love works sometimes. It shows up when you least expect it, in the most unlikely circumstances, and if you're brave enough to reach for it, it can transform your entire life. And his parents, sitting together on their porch with hands still intertwined after decades of marriage, would smile at each other and know that every word was true. Their love story had started with laundry and a ring, with loneliness and hope and a leap of faith. And it had grown into something neither of them could have imagined in their wildest dreams, something worth every hardship, every challenge, every moment of doubt. They'd found each other by the river, two lonely souls searching for something more. And together, they'd built a forever that was more beautiful than any fairy tale, more lasting than any promise, more real than any dream. Their love was written in the land they'd worked, in the children they'd raised, in every moment they'd shared, and every challenge they'd overcome. It was a love that had started with a simple question and a desperate hope, and it would endure long after they were gone, living on in the stories their children told and the legacy they'd built together on the Arkansas prairie. As Vincent and Josephine grew older, they watched with pride as their children built lives of their own. Tommy married a sweet-natured girl from a neighboring ranch, and they had 3 children who adored their grandparents. The twins both married, Sarah to a banker in town and Emma to one of the ranch hands who'd worked for Vincent for years. Daniel became a carpenter and furniture maker, his work sought after throughout the territory, and he married a schoolteacher who shared his love of learning. Only Grace remained at home, choosing to stay and help her aging parents run the ranch. She was in no hurry to marry, she said, though Josephine suspected it was more that Grace had inherited her mother's stubbornness and hadn't yet met anyone who could match her strong will. Tommy took over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, allowing Vincent to slow down and enjoy his later years. Vincent still rode out most days, but now it was for pleasure rather than necessity, checking on the cattle and the land he loved so dearly. Josephine's days were quieter too, filled with baking for her grandchildren and tending her garden and sitting on the porch with her needlework while Grace managed the household. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration that lasted 3 days. All the children and grandchildren were there, along with friends from town and neighboring ranches. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and speeches honoring the couple who'd built this legacy from nothing. When Vincent stood to say a few words, his voice was still strong despite his age. 30 years ago, I was just a cowboy with more hope than sense, too scared to approach the woman I loved. But somehow, I found the courage to try, and she was brave enough to say yes. Everything good in my life came from that one moment of courage. Our children, our grandchildren, this ranch, this life, all of it came from Josephine taking a chance on a broken-down cowboy who loved her beyond reason. "You were never broken," Josephine called out from her seat, making everyone laugh. "No," Vincent agreed, his eyes finding hers across the crowd. "I was just waiting to be found. And you found me, my love. You've been finding me every day for 30 years. There wasn't a dry eye in the house as Vincent made his way back to Josephine and took her hand. Their children raised glasses in toast, and the celebration continued late into the night. When it was finally over and everyone had gone home or to bed, Vincent and Josephine once again found themselves on their porch, watching the stars and listening to the prairie wind. 30 years, Josephine marveled. It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. "The best 30 years of my life," Vincent said. "And if God grants us 30 more, I'd spend every day grateful for the gift." They didn't get 30 more years, but they got 15, which was more than either of them had dared to hope. Vincent passed away at 72, dying peacefully in his sleep with Josephine beside him, his hand in hers just as it had been for 45 years. His last words were, "I love you," and Josephine whispered them back through her tears. She mourned him deeply but not desperately. They'd had a full life together, rich with love and accomplishment. He'd kept every promise he'd made that day by the river, and she'd done the same. There was nothing left unsaid between them, no regrets or unfinished business. Just a love that had lasted a lifetime and would continue beyond death. Josephine lived another 5 years after Vincent's passing, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren who began arriving with regularity. She told them all stories of their grandfather, of the cowboy who'd approached her with dirty laundry and an impossible dream. She showed them the ring that had started it all, still on her finger after all these years, and the necklace Vincent had given her on their 10th anniversary, which she never took off. When her time came, she went peacefully, sitting in her chair on the porch she'd shared with Vincent for so many years. Grace found her there in the morning, a smile on her face, her hand resting over the necklace at her throat. They buried her next to Vincent on the hill overlooking the ranch, and their children made sure their headstone told their story. Vincent and Josephine Irving. He brought his laundry and a ring. She brought her heart and her courage. Together, they built forever. The Double J Ranch continued to thrive under Tommy's management, and eventually his children's management. The cabin where Vincent and Josephine had started their life together was preserved as a sort of shrine, and family members would sometimes go there to feel close to the couple who'd started it all. The Hope chest Vincent had made still held its precious mementos, and each generation added their own memories to the collection. And sometimes, when the light was just right at sunset, people swore they could see two figures standing on that hill where Vincent and Josephine were buried, holding hands and watching over the land they'd loved so well. Whether it was real or imagined, it comforted those who saw it, reminding them that true love doesn't end with death. It endures, living on in the lives it touched and the legacy it created. The story of the cowboy and his laundry and his ring became family legend, passed down through generations. It was told at weddings and anniversaries, used as an example of what real love looked like. It reminded people that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, that courage can change everything, and that love, real love, is worth every risk and every sacrifice. Vincent and Josephine Irving had started with nothing but hope and ended with everything that mattered. Their love story, which began so improbably by a river in Arkansas, became the foundation for generations of happiness and success. And though they were gone, their love remained, as permanent and enduring as the land itself, a testament to the power of faith, courage, and two hearts brave enough to reach for each other across the distance of loneliness and fear. The river where they met still flows, carrying its eternal song through the Arkansas prairie. And if you listen carefully on quiet evenings, some say you can still hear laughter on the wind, the sound of two souls who found each other against all odds and loved with such strength and devotion that even death couldn't part them. Their forever had become exactly that forever living on in the land, in their descendants, in the very air of the Double J Ranch. It was the kind of love story that people dream about but rarely find, the kind that transforms not just two lives but countless others. And it all started with a simple act of courage. A cowboy approaching a woman washing clothes by a river, carrying his dirty laundry and a ring he'd saved 2 years to buy, daring to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd give him a chance. She did. And that chance became a lifetime, a legacy, and a love story that would be told for generations to come. The end of their earthly time together was not an ending at all, but rather a transformation, their love continuing in new forms through the family they'd created and the example they'd set. Their story proved that the best romances aren't always the easiest or the most convenient. Sometimes they require tremendous faith and courage. Sometimes they start in the most unlikely ways. But when two people are truly meant to be together, when they're willing to work hard and love harder, when they face life's challenges as partners and celebrate its joys as one, they can build something that transcends time itself. Vincent and Josephine Irving built that kind of love. And though their bodies rest beneath the Arkansas soil they worked so hard, their spirits live on, forever young, forever in love, forever standing by that river where it all began, where a cowboy brought his laundry and a ring, and a woman brave enough to say yes changed both their lives forever.